Now, did your father do any farming as well?
We farmed. We used to plant oats and potatoes in a garden, a vegetable garden. But mother would look after that, you know. While he'd be fishing, she would look after that. So my mother was a very hard-working woman. You know.
Would your mother be out in the fields?
Oh, out in the fields, yes. She'd be out in the fields, and I would be out in the fields, hauling and raking with the horse and machines.
And, of course, you had older brothers and sisters
yes,
that would help
but they went away. My older brothers were all gone away. By the time I was about 14, there was only Dora and I and the two younger fellas, Bob and...
And were you the youngest
girl?
Youngest girl.
Yes. But I was more of a tomboy. I would rather work outside than in the house.
Yeah, I see.
Yeah.
So it's... but everybody pitched together.
Everybody pitched together. In the winter, my mother would carve the wool. She'd carve it, and she'd spin it, and she'd knit it. And in the wintertime, we'd hook mats. So we're never really idle.
Since the people north of Smoky were isolated, especially in winter when the ferry from Sydney was not available, they had to provide their own entertainment. Earl, could you describe for me what it was like, St. Patrick's was like when you were growing up in Ingonish? St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah, begorra, I just wish that it was celebrated as much today as it used to be in them days. And those days, the only days better than that was Christmas and Easter and Good Friday. St. Patrick's, remember, we were cut off from the outside world, and horse and sleigh was the only way to get out. So you had to make your own brew. Hops made good beer, and so did cornmeal made good beer. And then we were practicing songs, and they always had a play act, a fairly good play too, and there were some pretty good actors in it. And they'd have lots of brew, as long as you didn't get too much. One old fella, he was going to sing I'll Take You Home Again, Kathleen, and he took it too high a note, and that was the awfulest screeching I ever heard. Somebody come in and said, "Who's been murdered?"
But it was also a holy day of obligation in the church, wasn't it?
Going to that, but as far as the church, there was Mass at 10 o'clock. It was a local holy day. If you weren't Irish, you were wishing you were. And even the priest had a great big shamrock on his vestments when he was saying Mass. And you want to hear one of the hymns?
Yes, I'd love to.
Well, this was in favor of St. Patrick, of course. The concert was the main thing. Sometimes they'd put a little concert on in the afternoon for the young people, whom they didn't want their tender ears to hear any of the strong talk that night. You know, and they'd get excited, especially if the villain was choking the girl. Some fella sitting in the audience, catch the SOB, catch him, can't you choke? Can't you see you choking that dear thing? So there were really more audience appreciation of acting than they are today. You just sit down looking at that television. But anyway, I'll sing you one of the songs that they all sang. Everybody knew it anyway. Hibernia's patron saint, all hail, with fadeless glory crowned. Thy children spread through many lands, this day thy praises sound. O St. Patrick, we proclaim thy fadeless glory far and wide. Grant that, shielded by thy name, we may at last with thee abide.
The great majority of Irish in Cape Breton were Roman Catholics, but as Mabou resident Jim St. Clair explains, there were Protestant Irish on the island as well.
William McKean's house here makes me think a lot about the Irish in this part of Inverness County. William McKean was of Scotch-Irish origin, that is to say his ancestors had come from Scotland to Ireland in the late part of the 1600s, stayed there for a generation or two, and then they came to Nova Scotia via New Hampshire. But he identifies himself on the census as being of Irish origin. The McKeans were amongst the very earliest settlers in Mabou, and they were of that group of Irish settlers here who were Protestant, who were Presbyterian. The McKean brothers and also the Wrights and the Benvys were amongst the early signers for the Presbyterian Church in Mabel. William McKean, just to say a few more words about him, was probably the most prominent person who lived in Mabel in the 1800s. He was very responsible for the development and the setting out of Mabel Village as it is today. He had a beautiful farm here, a 600-acre farm. He also built what I think is one of the most beautiful houses in all of rural Nova Scotia. He calls this place Clayton Farm. The building is 1846, 47, just about along in that period of time. The Irish in the 1818 census in Mabel were approximately 15% of the population here. After that time, a few more came, and they lived mostly in Brook Village, which at one time was really known by the Scots people as the Irish town, or the place where the Irish lived. Indeed, some of the Irish who lived there spoke their Irish Gaelic so clearly that the Scotch Gaelic people here could understand what they were saying and could communicate with them. I would want to say that amongst the storekeepers, amongst the early telegraph operators, amongst the mill owners, the people who were doing for their own day manufacturing, in running a small shoe factory, in harness making, and certainly in milling, in grist mills, the Irish were very important in the commercial and economic and probably intellectual development of this place. In addition to the settlers, there were some outstanding Irish school teachers here, the Burkes and also a man named Ayres, who I think also set a tone for the place which encouraged excellence in education. This property was settled by a Murphy man who came from Ireland to Pictou and then eventually came along to Mabel. He was married into one of the Loyalist families, and he sold his property to the McKeans. Amongst some of the other families that were important and went away from this place to make a name for themselves were the Marrs, who came to be very important in judicial circles in Halifax. They lived in Brook Village. The Murrays, who came to be outstanding merchants both here and in Halifax. The Murrays were also a group of Protestant Irish who settled here. The McKean family was probably the most widely spread of all the Irish here, because I think when they came here, they looked at the whole surrounding countryside, and one guy said, well, I'm going to take on the mills, and another guy said, I'm going to get a farm. William McKean opened a store and also had this farm, but he was primarily into merchandising and land acquisition. Another guy came to be a tanner and a maker of harness, and their brother-in-law was a cooper and also was a person who was involved in the manufacturing of harness and a number of other small occupations out towards Brook Village. So I think that when we look at the west coast of Cape Breton, apart probably from the Margarese and Port Hood, the Irish settlement in Mabel is the most important all along this coast. Certainly there were more Irish in Port Hood and in Margaree. They represented a larger percentage of the population. But the impact, even down to today, of the Irish in this place cannot be understated.
Just up the coast from William McKean at Mabou is the home of Peter Smith, a political and commercial rival of McKean. Born in Dublin in 1800, Peter Smith came to Nova Scotia at the age of 17. Eventually, he came to own stores in Port Hood and other towns, was Justice of the Peace for Inverness County, and served in the Nova Scotia legislature for 20 years. Later, he served on the Legislative Council until his death in 1879.